for the game. And in doing so, when you don't raise money, a lot of you do dip into your personal pockets to ensure that the games happen on Saturday. So we thought it would be beneficial to also have some around sponsorship so that we can also build and sharpen our skill set in that area. So as the game opens and as COVID comes to an end, I'm sure a lot of companies will be looking at how do they then re-engage with their customers. And rugby has to be the chosen sports platform, whether it's at the union level or at club level or at tournament level. So the purpose of this was really to then see how can we tap into some sports marketing expertise. And in the past, we've worked as a union with Agri Walumbwenyi, who many of you may know. And so I spoke to Agri and told him actually he needs to come and do some CSR for rugby, given his extensive experience and to tap out to his vast resource base. He then managed to engage a highly skilled professional in the sports marketing field who has also graciously agreed to be our main facilitator for today. So I'm very pleased that Richard Glover has joined the call and he's ready to go. He'll tell you which club he supports in Kenya, but he's been a keen follower of our local rugby as well, and has worked with various sponsors in Kenya. So he has a good feel of what's happening, what do we need to do, and what are the don't do's, and what must we do to be able to keep our sponsors. So without further ado, maybe I'll just invite Agri to say one or two things and then invite our main speaker for the day. But karibu sana. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have I seen ladies though? Seems like
ladies.
I'm trying to. Sorry.
There are several.
Okay. Yeah. So my name is Agre Obulwenyi. I work for a company called Locat Cyp, and basically we are a sports marketing company as well as a business intelligence firm, and we help KRU to package its assets, especially the sports assets, and putting them in front of potential customers, and also helping them manage some of those relationships. Because as you know, in sports sponsorship, it's all about relationships. And if any of those is harmed, you are likely, it becomes very expensive when you lose what you already have. And I get to understand that most of the clubs, especially in the lower leagues, they find it very difficult to secure sponsors because of the size of their fan base, because most of the sponsors actually are not really looking out for you as a sports asset, but probably they are looking for their own benefit in terms of growing their numbers. And so this evening, we're just looking at what are some of those things that at your community level you can do to engage the community to make your asset worthwhile for the bigger guys to look at. Or is it going to be a matter of collapsing your several small sports assets into a collective unit that then makes it more easy for you to get one person that supports your activities? The chairman has just alluded to the fact that it becomes very expensive, especially if you are forced to go back to your pocket to finance the activities and the programs of your respective teams and associations, in this regard, the union. And therefore, coming up with strategies to ensure that you have partners that are supporting you becomes very critical. And probably before I invite in Richard to speak to you about the whole scope of the presentation, I would like us to just quickly have a run through the sports ecosystem, especially the flow of the money. So I don't know whether I'm allowed to share a screen or it's only the admin.
You're allowed to share.
Okay. There you go. I don't know whether you are able to see it.
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah, so we will start with the two basic units of any sports ecosystem, and those are the clubs and the leagues. And these are the basic nerve center of any sports environment. And when you look at it properly, the first thing that comes to your mind are the fans, who of course inject money into the leagues through ticketing and to their respective clubs through ticketing and merchandising. When it comes to Kenya, and this is not unique to rugby, you'll notice that the fan base is quite low. So when it comes to the gate fees and the ticketing and similar things, this is where we have been falling short. And probably this is where we need to start changing the narrative and getting people to come back to the stadium to watch these matches live. And I think probably, and Richard will speak more to it, in the UK, they started quite early, especially taking examples of football, the EPL, where they started admitting the young ones free of charge and only charging the adults, and even ladies, if I'm not wrong. I think for quite some years, the ladies were never paid for tickets for English Premier League. And this really helped create a culture of going to the stadiums on Saturday and Sunday afternoons. I don't know whether this is practical in Kenya. I think it should, and something probably we might want to look at it. Another key component is the media, and we are looking at the pay TV subscriptions in this respect. But of course, Kenya, this space is quite limited. I think the only players in this space are DSTV, Zuku, and I think the current KRU partner in the name of Bamba TV. I don't know whether that deal is still on. So when it comes to this, I think you need to be very careful on how to package so that you don't sell all your eggs for the cheap, because that is how some of the media practitioners have been taking advantage of sporting assets in Kenya, where they lump all the rights, from digital rights to TV rights to social media rights to live and residual rights, all bundled into one. So by this, you see that sometimes sports assets are unable to even break even using that kind of sponsorship money, which we are referring to as TV rights. Now, a key component to this is obviously brands that are looking for the eyeballs through the media and are looking at softening the hearts of the fans through sponsoring the leagues as well as the clubs. So when you look at this whole ecosystem, you'll find that things that give you money basically are the fans, the media, as well as the brands. These three components are quite key. And I remember, I think a few years back, when KRU was a darling of all the corporate sponsors in Kenya, and because of a few things, it could be the doing or not the doing of KRU, the current office, but you find that that some of those relationship issues affected how the brands started relating with with the union, and then it became a toxic relationship where some of the top brands were telling other smaller brands who wanted to come in that this is not worthwhile. And I think credit goes to the current office that have tried to pair that shortfall, and probably Chairman might speak more to that. And we have seen people starting to come back. In terms of media, that is quite a tight one, because most of the media houses in Kenya right now, I think, do not have a lot of leverage in terms of the money because of the shrinking environment, and fans are looking for performance on the pitch. It's quite a very dicey relationship when you look at how the fans relate with the sports assets and the leagues. For example, they want a team to go and always win. And when of course winning is not there, apathy sets in. And this is not entirely because of the teams that are represented here today or the union, but probably because of the financing that comes with it. And of course, we have not added government as a source of financing, because in an ideal environment, sports is supposed to be self-sustaining. Now, when all these monies have been collected from the value chain, the revenue goes to the clubs, of course, from the leagues, as well as transfer fees within the clubs themselves. So you get that a player is moving from one club to the other and vice versa, and therefore transfer fees start gaining momentum. I think in Kenyan rugby scene, probably this aspect of making money has not been exploited well, because the valuation of the players have not been gotten correctly, and this is something we need to address. And of course, once the players get once the clubs get the money, they of course channel to the players through salaries and allowances, as well as other people around the players, like the agents, also benefit. So you get that this ecosystem is probably a summary of what maybe members of this webinar need to look at. And I'm happy to share after this if need be, so that when you are looking at it, you know where your money comes from and where it's going to be spent, and where are the gaps that we can help plug. Is it the fan base? Is it a relationship with the brands? Or is it that we're not packaging our rights properly as far as the media is concerned? Or is our league not a good format that attracts fans as well as the media in that respect? So I think if there's no quick reaction to that, probably I will hand over to Richard.
Thank you. Thanks. Can everyone hear me all right? I'm obviously a long way away from everyone else. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So it's a real privilege to be in the home of Sevens Rugby, coming to you obviously in Nairobi in Kenya. I just wanted to point to my background behind me, just to remind everyone who are the world champions of 15s rugby at the moment. I hope there are a few South African and Springbok supporters there. I'm sure there are a few New Zealand and All Black supporters, but I hope some of you also follow the Springboks as well. Before everyone joined us on this call, I was chatting to the chairman and I was asking him which is the number one or which is the top rugby club in Kenya, and he said to me it's definitely Impala Saracens. Is that correct?
No, it can't be Impala. He knows very well. Impala was my students. There's only one university in Kenya Cup, which is Black Blood. That should be the best club in Kenya.
Yeah, I've got a confession to make. I'm actually a Mean Machine supporter, so I don't know if there's anyone here who's played for the Mean Machine historically, but that's my team in Kenya, the famous Mean Machine. Look, so let's get started. I mean, I think what I'd like to do is maybe give you a presentation for 10 or 15 minutes and just give you some insights into how we think about things and how we approach things. But I'd also really like this to be interactive, and that's probably the most important part of this session, is the interactive chance to really have a discussion, because I don't have all the answers. And I certainly don't have the answers for the challenges that Kenya faces. I really think this group of people and the wider rugby community in Kenya will have the answers for the challenges that Kenya rugby faces. I'm really here to maybe ask some questions and maybe help you come to the right questions and maybe help you come to some of those answers, but I don't certainly have all the answers. Okay, let's start with the presentation. So hopefully this will work. You never know with technology. Can everyone see my screen? Can everyone see that?
Yeah,
Yep.
sure.
Okay. That's obviously a very famous moment in Kenya Sevens rugby history, if I'm not mistaken. So let's really get started. And I guess the first question that some of you are asking is, who is this guy from South Africa? So I'm actually currently the CEO of Tennis South Africa. So I run a sports federation in South Africa, obviously responsible for the sports of tennis in the country. And I'm sure some of you are wondering, what is a tennis guy here talking about rugby? What does he know about rugby? Well, hopefully over the course of the next 45 minutes or hour or so, you'll get a sense of who I am and what I do. In terms of the agenda, what I'd like to do is maybe just give you a sense of my background in terms of what I've been involved in, not my whole life history, but just some of the key points. I'd also like to share with you some of the lessons I've learned in terms of my journey through sports sponsorship and sports marketing, both in the UK, but in parts of Africa and also South Africa. I'd like us to have a discussion about COVID-19 in terms of the new reality that it's created for all of us. But as I said earlier, the key thing for me is really having a really good debate and discussion about how can Kenyan rugby and how can the clubs within Kenyan rugby and how can all aspects of the Kenyan rugby ecosystem really move forward and really look to make more money that can be invested back into the game. So that's really the structure. I don't know if anyone has any questions at this stage. Everyone comfortable with that? Okay, so let's get started. This just gives you a sense of my background. As I say, I am currently CEO of Tennis South Africa, but I did spend a number of years at Arsenal Football Club. I don't know if there's any Arsenal football supporters out there. I was there in the last year of Highbury Stadium and the first 4 or 5 years at Emirates Stadium. So I was there at a very interesting time in the football club's history. And I worked in the sort of the commercial and media rights area. But I do have some experience in rugby. I used to run a sports marketing agency, and one of our clients in South Africa was the Sharks Super Rugby franchise. So we found all of the sponsors and sourced all the sponsors and helped execute a lot of the sponsorship agreements for the Sharks rugby team. I was also involved in a very interesting event called the Cape Town Tens, which actually started out, it was started by, I don't know if you remember the former Springbok players, Bob Skinstad and Robbie Fleck. They started that, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And it started off as a social rugby event for them and their friends. It's now a multi-sport party that takes place in February every year in Cape Town, South Africa. It attracts about 30,000 people a day. And South African breweries, who obviously are the big brewery and beer producer in South Africa, say that apparently the average customer per day drinks 15 beers a day at the Cape Town Tens. So that gives you a sense of it's probably one of the biggest rugby parties in South Africa, but it's also become a massive, as I said, multi-sport event where there's rugby and sports through the day, and there's music and a lot of entertainment during the evening. And then just an interesting one, which might surprise you because I'm working in tennis, and I'm sure some of you see tennis as being the sport where people eat strawberries and they drink champagne, which is partly true. But I used to also be involved in something called the Extreme Fighting Championship. I did all the sponsorship and broadcasting deals for the Extreme Fighting Championship, which is cage fighting. I don't know if you follow the UFC, but it's like Africa's version of the UFC. So I've got some really interesting background, both in rugby, but also in other sports. And I think it's always interesting to hear from other sports in terms of some of the lessons from other sports that could potentially be carried across in terms of rugby. Let's move on to the next slide. So let's talk about Arsenal Football Club. As I said, I spent 5 or 6 years at Arsenal Football Club. And I think it's a fascinating business, and I think there's some fascinating lessons for Kenyan sport, but particularly for Kenyan rugby. I think, as some of you know, if you follow soccer or football, is that Arsenal Football Club haven't necessarily won many trophies in recent years after a sort of a golden period in the late 90s and early 2000s when the Invincibles were running rampant throughout England. But at the same time, it's still, despite not winning many trophies, it still exists and still operates as one of the most economically successful football clubs, not only in England in the Premier League, not only in Europe, but across the world as well. And I think some of those lessons are really, really important because, as you know, in sport, you can't guarantee success on the pitch or on the field. But I think what you can do is you can do a lot of things off the field that can assist your sport or your club or your organization to make money even during the difficult times. And so these are just some of the lessons that I learned while I was at Arsenal. The first lesson I learned was the importance of building your own digital platforms and creating your own content. And I think what the English football clubs did really, really well at the onset of the digital revolution, but also the growth of social media, was to really focus on their digital platforms, both in terms of their website, but also their social media platforms, and really from an early stage start to produce content for those platforms and start to grow audiences. And what that means now is, even though Arsenal are not even a Champions League club anymore, and let's be frank, they are now a Europa League club in terms of the competition below that, they are still don't have any problems attracting sponsors and significantly big sponsorships. Now, I'll show you some numbers shortly just in terms of the size of Arsenal's digital platforms. But what it does show is the importance of really investing in your platform so that even if you're not strong on the pitch at any one time, you can still be strong off the pitch. But more of that shortly. I think the other big lesson that the English football clubs have really taught people, and also I guess the American sports have really taught people, is the importance of investing in the event experience. And it's really, what I'm saying is really putting your feet in the shoes of your customer and really understanding what they want and some of the challenges they face and some of the issues they have about going to sport. And I can tell you in South Africa, we have a lot of challenges attracting live audiences to many of our sports. And I think one of the big reasons for that is we tend to deliver a very poor event experience. And it's really taking care of the basic things. So I know Agri, I think, was talking about women in rugby and maybe trying to grow the fan base of women in rugby. Did you know that the number one complaint of female sports spectators in South Africa, and the number one reason why they don't visit stadiums and stadia, is the state of the toilets? So that's their number one and biggest complaint. And when you think about it, it's quite an obvious thing, but it's also quite a simple thing to fix. It's about thinking about who is your target market, who is your audience, and how do we cater for them. And I think investing in the event experience and understanding the event experience is important for this next reason. And that is, I think, what the football clubs in England have understood, what the big sports leagues in America have understood, is that, and I think what Kenyan sports and South African sport needs to understand is, as Kenyan rugby clubs, you're actually not in competition with each other. You're not even in competition with the KPL or any other sport. You're actually in competition with everything. Every single part of life. I think people now, well, before COVID-19 anyway, people had so many choices and options that I think sports teams and clubs need to realize that they're in competition and they're in the entertainment business. And unfortunately, it's no longer just what's about happening on the field and the pitch. It's just as important as happening off the pitch and off the field as well. So let's move on and let's look at Arsenal. I talked about the power of their digital platforms. These are their current stats in terms of their digital platforms. I just took four of the big four. So Facebook, Arsenal currently has 37.1 million followers on Facebook, 17.5 million followers on Instagram, 15 and nearly 16 million followers on Twitter, and close to 2 million subscribers or viewers on YouTube. And those are incredibly powerful numbers, I think you would agree. But what that does show is that Arsenal Football Club and many other football clubs in England have focused obsessively on growing those platforms and growing those audiences on those platforms. And that's why they're in a position, as I said, where even though Arsenal are no longer a Champions League team, they're now a Europa League team, they can still attract big sponsorships because they can deliver audiences off the field, even if they're not necessarily being successful on the field. Now the obvious point to say is that, okay, those are big numbers. We don't have anywhere near Arsenal's budgets, obviously. We'll never ever get to those numbers. But let's look at these numbers in the context of Kenyan rugby. I don't know if you can see that. So the Arsenal numbers are at the top in blue. And what I quickly did was I just looked at the KRU's, for comparison purposes, social media platforms. Facebook, nearly 65,000. Instagram, just over 19,000. Twitter, which is remarkable considering Facebook tends to be much bigger than Twitter from a sport perspective. Twitter, nearly 108,000 people, and YouTube, 1.1 thousand people. So there's actually a lot of potential there from a platform perspective. And I think with the right strategy, there's no reason why those numbers couldn't double in the next year. But I was also then thinking, and I wanted to say, okay, so that's the Kenya Rugby Union platforms. But what about a lot of the other clubs in Kenya? Because all of those, I assume all of your clubs have a lot of social media platforms where you're engaging with your individual club supporters. And so what I did quickly just before this call is I just looked at 5 rugby clubs that were on Twitter. So I looked at Impala Saracens, 35,000 people on Twitter. Quins, 15.2 thousand people on Twitter. I thought Quins would be bigger, but anyway. Wamba, 21,500 on Twitter. Homeboys, 8,500 on Twitter. Nondis, just over 14,000 people on Twitter. So if you add those 5 clubs up alone, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to exclude any other clubs. I just did this quickly. But if you were to add those 5 clubs up together, that's nearly 95,000 people that those clubs combined attract. So I guess one of the questions that I'd like to debate later is, you've all got social media platforms. The KRU has a very, very solid presence on social media. Is there not the opportunity to combine all of your social media platforms together? Because when you think about KRU having 108,000 people on Twitter, and those 5 clubs that I mentioned having nearly 95,000 people on Twitter, sure, there'll be an overlap, but combined, those audiences are becoming very, very attractive to potential sponsors. So that's something I want you to think about as we continue this discussion and engagement. I want to talk about the Savannah Bananas. This is an interesting one. We tried to test the video earlier and it didn't seem to work, so I'm not going to play the video. But I'd urge you to just write down the Savannah Bananas and just to go and investigate it and look into it on YouTube and on the internet. Now, the Savannah Bananas are a baseball team in Savannah, Georgia. They play right at the bottom of the baseball structure in America. So there's nowhere else for them to go. They can't go further down. They're right at the bottom. They're an amateur baseball team in Savannah, as I said. And for the last 3 seasons, they've sold out their stadium in Savannah, which is a 4,000 capacity stadium, for every single home game for the last 4 seasons. And it's a 4,000 capacity stadium. So this is an amateur team at the very bottom of American baseball that has basically managed to sell out their stadium for 4 years running and attracting crowds of 4,000 people per match. And I think one of the things that they've done really, really well is they've recognized the point that if you follow, I don't know if anyone's ever tried to watch a baseball match, but it takes a long time and it's very long. And so what they've done is they've really looked at creating a night out and an entertainment experience for their spectators and their fans. And they do all sorts of weird and crazy stuff. And so people come for the baseball, but critically, they also come for the social side and the good times. And I wish I could show you the video because you would really get a sense of what I'm talking about. But they are out the box thinkers, and I'd really encourage you to look at that, how they've managed with almost budgets and almost no marketing budget at all to sell out, as I said, every single home game for the last 3 or 4 years, which is an incredible achievement. And they're not afraid to try things, crazy things. And as I said, please look at the Savannah Bananas because it's a really interesting thing. And I'm not saying you all need to suddenly start rebranding your club names to fruit. I'm not saying Impala Saracens should become the Impala Apples or the Nondis Oranges or whatever. But what Savannah Bananas have realized is to really attract interest now and to stand out from the crowd. You have to do things differently and you have to push the boundaries. And as I said earlier, it's not just about what happens on the field or the pitch or the arena of play. It's now actually even more important off the field. and what's happening around the field as opposed to on the field. Now, I'm sure some of you are traditional rugby people and rugby men and women, and you'll be horrified by what I'm saying to you. But this is the reality of what you need to understand and what you need to deal with as if you are to grow your sports and market your sport. Okay. I want to talk about tennis, and tennis is an interesting one because when I was approached to become CEO of Tennis South Africa,
Richard, maybe
yes?
just to, I could potentially maybe help you play the Savannah Bananas.
Can you agree?
Yes. So maybe maybe you can stop the share, then I jump in to help play that.
There we go. Let's try.
It's a steamy Thursday evening in Savannah, Georgia. The guy in the yellow tuxedo is gearing up to entertain a sold-out crowd of baseball fans.
We're all about the show. And if I'm going to be on the field creating all this excitement and entertainment, I need to look like a showman. I looked actually online and I found brightcoloredtuxedos.com. I own 5 of them.
Jesse Cole didn't set out to reinvent baseball. His plan was to pitch in the major leagues. Then a shoulder injury in college disrupted everything.
So that ended my baseball career. And shortly after that, I got an opportunity to be an intern for a summer collegiate team. And I took that internship and had a lot of fun with it. And right out of college at 23 years old, I got offered the job as a general manager of the Gastonia Grizzlies in Gastonia, North Carolina. So that's where it started.
Jesse had his work cut out for him. The Gastonia Grizzlies were one of the worst teams in the country. The struggling organization was losing money. They had no fans, and the team was demoralized.
I realized, wow, we have a serious problem here. What did I just walk into? So I started trying to learn everything I could about the baseball business, but more about the entertainment business. And I read every book I could, and I started realizing, wow, we can't be a baseball team anymore.
He was most inspired by P.T. Barnum, Walt Disney, and the legendary baseball owner Bill Beck. He decided the solution for the team was speeding up the game and making it more fun by providing non-stop entertainment.
Baseball needs to change. And the reality is, if you look at all the businesses now, they're being disrupted every single day. They're being new and unique to go with today's culture. Baseball has remained the same for over 100 years. And it was a great game, and it still is a great game. It needs to change if it's going to be the great game. And throughout those first few years, we learned so much, but what happened was that everyone started paying attention to the team, and attendance started.
Then, he and his new wife and business partner, Emily, had an unexpected offer they just couldn't refuse. The owner of the team wanted to sell.
Everyone looks at me and they say, yeah, you're a younger person. How do you buy baseball teams? And I go, you take on a lot of that. And, it was a lot of responsibility, but really it gave us this unbelievable feeling of ownership that we can do anything. And there's no red tape. The 2014, 2015, 2016 seasons were tremendously successful for Gastonia, even as we had bigger goals to start new franchises.
Jesse and Emily felt they had a formula to market baseball in a new way. And as luck would have it, they heard about an opportunity in the much bigger market of Savannah, where a minor league team called the Sand Gnats was leaving.
Their numbers were down, and from what we were hearing and from what everybody was saying in the public, the team blamed the stadium, that we needed a new ballpark, that was going to be the catalyst to turning Savannah into a successful minor league market.
When they saw the beautiful, historic Grayson Stadium, they knew it would be the perfect home for starting a new team and resurrecting baseball in Savannah.
We always want to bring life back to old things. We're very nostalgic in that sense. And we knew that the potential was here. Savannah is an amazing city. And yet you have this huge landmark that's empty. And from that moment, we were talking to the commissioner of the league and starting to get ideas and knew that someday it could be something.
The success the Coles had in Gastonia encouraged the Coastal Plain League commissioner to support them in launching a new summer collegiate team in Savannah.
It's our first franchise in the state of Georgia, and going into a minor league type atmosphere where people were a little hesitant about who we were and whether or not we would be successful.
The support for the new team in Savannah was lukewarm at best.
We put everything we had to start up the team. And then for some reason, the city just didn't pay into us. It seemed like, who are these guys? It's college summer baseball. It's not professional. We don't understand this. And no one was buying tickets. There was no excitement. There was no energy. We didn't have a name yet, and just no one was paying attention.
So Jesse put on his P.T. Barnum hat and remembered the famous quote, "Without promotion, something terrible happens. Nothing."
So we did a Help Us Name the Team contest. We wanted to get the community involved. We don't want to be something generic, especially not something potentially nasty like a sandman. We want to be something that people like.
They got thousands of responses, but one stood out.
We had one suggestion from this woman, and it was the bananas. And my wife and I looked at each other. We talked to our president and said, you know what? And for the next couple of weeks, we started just thinking about all the different ideas. But we also looked at each other and said, the community can hate it. And so we were so nervous. We said, but you know what? You got to take chances. If it's normal, do the exact opposite. And there's no team in the country that's a banana. There's no team named after fruit. Let's do it. And so we went all in and said, let's roll the dice and introduce the community to Savannah Bananas.
Toby Wright has been coming to baseball games at Grayson Stadium since he was 4 years old. His response to the new team name was echoed all over Savannah.
I was not happy to see it. I'm not gonna lie. I did not like it at first. I hated it.
Channeling P.T. Barnum again, Jesse and Emily pushed through the negative response, clinging to the idea that there's no such thing as bad publicity.
They have done a wonderful job here in Savannah, and it was not without hurdles, not without a lot of naysayers, and so I commend Jesse and Emily on not letting that tear you down, being optimistic and persevering.
With the start of the season, the community began to embrace the young team, loving the fact that ticket prices included unlimited food, tons of giveaways, and a run of show that rivals a 3-ring circus.
It's fun, it's entertaining, it's a show. It just happens instead of having a movie showing, we've got a baseball game in the background. But there's interaction, there's life. You hear it when you're parking and getting out of the car, walking in, and you see it in the crowd. Everybody's having fun, a family-friendly atmosphere, being able to be cost affordable for a family of 4, to be able to escape reality for 3 hours or so and come out here and enjoy yourself without it hurting your wallet is fantastic. But the job that they have done here with the Savannah Bananas really was what Savannah needed.
They got a fairy tale ending. The Savannah Bananas won the playoffs in their inaugural season, giving them a huge boost for their second year, with most games sold out. And they have a contingent of diehard fans now making it the hardest ticket to get in town.
Thanks, Agri. So, look, I'm not saying you must all now go out and rush out and buy yellow tuxedos and yellow hats and things, and that you'll think everywhere suddenly you'll have 4,000 people at your stadiums. But what I think what it does show is that you don't have to spend huge amounts of money on the event experience. You just need to be creative and think outside the box and really think about what would people enjoy? What do you enjoy? What do your friends enjoy about going to an event, and really applying some of those lessons to your clubs. So interestingly, it's like some of the stuff that the Savannah Bananas do. So they obviously play in yellow, but when they start their season, they play in green because they're saying they're not quite ripe yet. They'll get ripe during the season. So they do those all sorts of things. One of the games, they actually played in kilts. They actually played a game in kilts. So I'm not suggesting you should play in kilts, but it did make and although you might get a bigger female audience if you did that, but what I'm saying is you mustn't be afraid to try things and out-the-box things. And I know it's not a traditional way of thinking, and rugby doesn't tend to do this, but you really need to think creatively. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. Where did we leave off? Hopefully it's there. There we go. Can we see that? Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay, so let's talk about tennis. And I know it's a funny thing to talk about tennis when we should be talking about rugby, but I think there's some interesting lessons for you here. When I was offered the job at Tennis South Africa and I decided to take the job as CEO of Tennis South Africa, someone who I respected very much in the South African sports industry said I was crazy, said tennis was a tiny sport, tennis had failed to attract any sponsors for the last 10 years, and that he would eat his hat before I would be able to sign a single sponsor for tennis. 3 years later, Tennis South Africa is sitting with 8 sponsors. We've got some big sponsorships as well. It's a combination of both South African brands, but also global brands as well. One of our biggest sponsors is a French bank called BNP Paribas. So if you watch tennis, if you watch the French Open, you will see BNP Paribas all over the French Open, a massive French bank that's investing a lot of money in South African tennis. So my message to you is, if we can find sponsors for tennis, which let's be honest is a second-tier sport in South Africa and most countries around the world, then it is possible to find more sponsors and bring in commercial revenue for rugby, particularly in a country like Kenya, where rugby is obviously a popular sport. So what did we do from a Tennis South Africa perspective to attract 8 sponsors in the last 3 years? And the key thing also to say is we've also kept them as well. So one of our other big sponsors is a very big property company that owns commercial properties in Australia, South Africa, and Europe, called Growth Point Properties. We initially signed them for 2 years, and they've just extended on a big 3-year extension. So they've now obviously will spend at least 5 years with Tennis South Africa. And what we did is as follows. Let me just click on the screen. I think what we did at the very, very beginning was we identified our USPs. And what USPs means is unique selling points. Now, every sport in every country has unique selling points. Rugby in Kenya certainly has unique selling points. And you will certainly know what those selling points are. But we'll talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. And I'll explain what tennis's unique selling points are. Then critically, what we did is once we identified what tennis in South Africa's unique selling points were, we then identified brands that we thought would be a good fit for those unique selling points. So what I'm saying is, let's use a very obvious example. If your unique selling points are that you attract kids or that you attract families, you are obviously not going to go and try and sell a sponsorship to a beer brand. But if you feel like your unique selling points are such that you attract an audience of adult males, then you are going to go to a beer brand. I hope that makes sense. This is something that really frustrates me about sports federations in general in Africa, but also South Africa as well, is that we tend to see sponsorship as a donation. So we go to a sponsor and beg them to sponsor us, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But even the ones that do tend to hang around for a year or two and then leave because it's a donation. And we don't really look at it as a business transaction. And that's probably the most important lesson that I can give, or most important message that I can give to anyone listening to this, is that sponsorship is not a donation. Sponsorship has to be a business transaction. And the way for it to move from a donation to a business transaction is for you as a club or an organization to show, one, that you have a clear vision for where you want to go as a club or an organization. 2, that you have a very clear plan to reach that vision. And 3, most importantly, that you're actually showing signs of progress in terms of that plan. Because it's easy to have a vision to say, I don't know, you want to be the biggest rugby club in Kenya in the next 5 years in terms of social media platforms, et cetera, et cetera. And it's quite easy to come up with a plan to achieve that. But can you actually execute on that plan? And that's why signs of progress are really, really important. So from a Tennis South Africa perspective, that's what we did. We came up with a very clear vision in terms of where we wanted to take the game of tennis in South Africa. We came up with a very clear plan in terms of how we were going to do that. And critically, before we went to any sponsors, we started to show signs of progress on that, to show that we were more than just talk, we were about action. And that's really, really important. Clear vision, a clear plan, and signs of progress. And then another critical aspect for us was demonstrating that we have good governance, that the money that a sponsor is paying us is being spent on the things that are in the contract. So if a sponsor is paying to sponsor something, category A, you're not spending the money on category B, if that makes sense. And that's absolutely critical. And I'm sure it's an important factor for any potential sponsor in Kenya as well. And I think the thing that we've done most successfully, and I think this is also a good lesson, is really turning your challenges into sponsorship opportunities. Turning your challenges into sponsorship opportunities. And what I mean by that is really identifying what are the biggest challenges in your sports, and then going to a sponsor and saying, listen, sponsor A, this is our challenge. this is our vision and our plan to solve this challenge. Would you like to go along on this journey with us and ultimately take a lot of the credit if we can solve some of these challenges? So I'll give you an example from a tennis perspective. One of the biggest challenges that tennis as a sport in South Africa has, and as a secondary sport in South Africa, is that we're struggling, or have been struggling, should I say, to grow participation at schools level. And obviously, if you have declining participation at schools level, then your whole future of your sport is in jeopardy for obvious reasons. And so we said, okay, we've got this challenge. We're having seen declining participation at schools level, particularly at primary schools level. So can we turn this challenge of declining participation into an opportunity? And we said, okay, this is the opportunity. Let's find a sponsor who wants to grow schools tennis in this country, transform schools tennis in this country, and make it more accessible to more communities in this country. So we went to BNP Paribas, the French bank that I spoke about, and a subsidiary of theirs called RCS, Rising Star, RCS. And we actually created a concept with them called Rising Star Tennis, which is a national competition to find the best boys and girls school tennis teams in the country. It was launched last year. It's now being extended into high schools. And it's the first year was perceived as a massive success in terms of re-energizing schools tennis and getting more kids excited about playing tennis again. So that's a tennis example of how we took a challenge and actually took it to a sponsor and said, sponsor, we have this challenge. Let's work with you to turn it around and create an opportunity. And as a sponsor, you can take a lot of the credit for doing that. Now let's talk about USPs. Now, one of the challenges, or the many challenges that tennis has, is that it's not a team sport. Now, the challenge around being an individual sport is that it's obviously one player or two players on one side of a net facing one player or two players on the other side of the net. So at any one time, there's only a maximum of 4 players on a field, or a pitch, or a tennis court, should I say, versus rugby, where there's obviously 15 aside. And that obviously means that the numbers in and around tennis are always going to be smaller, both from a participation perspective, but also from a fan perspective. So that's a massive challenge for a sport like tennis. But what we've done really well, I think, is to really understand what are the unique selling points of a sport like tennis. And let me show you what the unique selling points are. So top left-hand side, there's close to 700,000 active tennis players in South Africa. I mean, that's based on research, so it's verifiable data, and I think that surprises a lot of people. In terms of participation, there's a very even balance between men and women, slightly skewed towards men. And this is important. Young females are the #1 fans of tennis in the country. But critically, over 60% of tennis players in South Africa work in managerial occupations. So that's important from a tennis perspective, because although our audience is relatively small, they tend to be very highly educated and tend to be business decision makers. And critically, so that's on one side. And on the other side, arguably tennis is the most gender-friendly sport in the country in terms of players and spectators. And that there's a very even split between men and women. And really, those are the two key unique selling points that tennis in South Africa has. Business decision makers play tennis. It's the most gender-friendly, robust. So what we did, as I said, is we've identified what makes tennis unique in this country versus rugby in South Africa, or cricket in South Africa, or football in South Africa. And we've taken those unique selling points and we said, okay, what brands out there want to talk to business decision makers? Well, Growth Point Properties, as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest commercial and retail property companies in the Southern Hemisphere. They obviously want to talk to business decision makers because they want business decision makers to move into their commercial properties or take up stores in their retail areas. So that's a really good example of identifying a brand that needs to talk to business decision makers and really linking them into tennis. I don't know if there's any questions at this stage, or can we move on to COVID-19? Because I'm just conscious of time. No questions. Let's move on. So I think we all know that COVID-19 is a massive challenge for everyone around the globe. I can't think of a single person or a single country that hasn't been impacted by COVID-19. And I just wanted to read you a quote from IEG, which is a global sponsorship valuation company. So they basically value sponsorships for brands, and they value sponsorships for rights holders, so clubs and teams. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to you, but what they said is that brands are necessarily rethinking every sport investment from a value basis. And some properties won't make the cut. Properties will have to look beyond the previous, often antiquated grant of rights to create new and, more importantly, measurable benefits for brands. And so what they're saying is, if you do what you've always done and you think you can do that in the new environment, you're very much mistaken. Because if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten. And in this case, you'll probably get less than you've always gotten. And so this is really about a new mindset shift for all sporting organizations and all clubs in the world to think about, is that you can't think that, one, sponsorship will work on a donation basis. Two, that if you go to someone and say, I'll put your brand on my playing shirt and put your brand in terms of signage around the field, that will even work. I think you're pretty much dead in the water. Those things are still important, but much more, there's much more fresh thinking about the online platforms. What are you doing for your sponsors from an online and digital and social perspective in terms of audiences? What are you doing in terms of the event experience to make it exciting, like the Savannah Bananas have done? Because ultimately, sponsorship is about two things. It's about you are giving a brand an access to your audience. So that's your audience in the stadium. And it's obviously your responsibility to grow that audience, like the Savannah Bananas have done. And then obviously on the online and social media platforms as well, in terms of think about what Arsenal have done in terms of growing their platforms. And I think you really have a unique opportunity out of COVID-19 to really focus on your online and digital platforms, but critically work together and combine them to have a much bigger number in from an audience perspective. And rather than going to sponsors on a fragmented basis, going to them collectively as a group. And this is really the opportunity. So this is a quote from Murray Barnett, who's the Chief Commercial Officer for World Rugby at the moment. This is speaking about events specifically, because a lot of people are obviously worried quite naturally about what will it mean for live sporting events once the restrictions that are currently in place from a COVID-19 perspective are lifted. And Murray Barnett makes a very good point. He says, as cabin fever or virus fatigue continues to grow, people will want to worship in the temples of their favorite sports and clubs. Fans will be more discerning about where they go and what events they spend their money on. They will also be slow to come back, but will come back to those events that are offering a high quality and health conscious experience, as well as value for money. So what rugby really needs to be thinking about in the post-COVID-19 environment, or living with COVID-19 environment, is we obviously need events to drive our sport, because there's no way you can drive a sport without events. That's the reality. But what can we do to make these events better than they were before in terms of their quality and the experience, ensuring they observe all social distancing and health protocols and deliver value for money? And I think this is a real opportunity for rugby to actually really think about what is its value proposition moving forward, particularly from a match day experience perspective, and actually say we need to be brave and we need to try new things, and maybe we need to go down the route of a Savannah Bananas and try crazy things and try different things just to get people excited about rugby and differentiate. Because I don't know what the current environment is like, the sporting environment is like in Kenya, but I'm not sure many people are sports organizations in Kenya really thinking about how they can completely reposition themselves, do aspects for their particular sport. So let's move on to the Q&A discussion. And before we get to the Q&A discussion, I'd like to pose a few questions to you, maybe as a starting point, and then we can really open it up to have a good debate and a good discussion. And I'd really like to hear your views, because as I said, it's Kenyan rugby people that are going to find the solutions to the challenges that Kenyan rugby faces. I can't offer you those solutions. I can just offer you insights and my perspectives and my experiences. So there's some of the questions I'd really like to ask, and I'd really like you to answer me is what are the biggest challenges facing rugby in Kenya? And I'm not just saying COVID-19, because that's obvious and we need to discuss that. But before COVID-19, what were the biggest challenges facing rugby in Kenya? In the context of unique selling points, as I said, is what is unique, or what are the unique selling points about rugby in Kenya that can differentiate from club rugby, and the KRU can differentiate against other sports? Do you understand who your audience or fan base is? I'd really like you to answer this question. Why do you think a brand should sponsor rugby in Kenya over anything else? Why should a brand sponsor rugby versus the KPL or versus a music event or versus a gospel music event? Do clubs in Kenya work together? Do they work collectively to maximize revenue using those social media numbers as an example? Clubs work with the KRU to maximize revenue as well. So I'm saying, do clubs collaborate and go and maybe say and package all of their rights together in one proposition and go to a sponsor and say, instead of sponsoring one club, you can sponsor 4 clubs. And these are all the collective benefits you get. Can rugby in Kenya take advantage of the post-COVID-19 environments? And the final question, and I think this is the most important question of all, because it talks to everything and it's a central theme throughout this presentation and indeed this discussion. Is rugby in Kenya willing to be brave? Because if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten. And in the post-COVID-19 environment, if you do what you've always done, you get less than you've always gotten before. That's my feeling anyway. So thanks everyone. That's enough of me talking. I'd like to really hear you talking as well now, please. So I'm going to stop the share and let's go back to the full screen. Do we have a moderator who can moderate questions?
Hi, Richard. Thanks so much for the presentation. I'd actually asked for people with questions to post them in the chat. It hasn't happened, but I'll just leave it open. If you have a question, please unmute yourself and just ask the question, and Richard will take it up. Thanks.
Okay. While people are thinking about their questions, can I, as I say, just go back to my questions that I posed at the end of my presentation? And before COVID-19, I mean, what were the biggest challenges facing Kenyan rugby? What would you say were the biggest challenges and potentially the biggest obstacles to you attracting sponsors, or bigger sponsors, should I say? There were no challenges, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, no challenges. Everything was perfect.
You're thinking.
Solomon looks like he wants to say something. Solomon?
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I can say okay, from Kakamega, club like Western Bulls, we used to charge fans to watch the match, and then at that time we were the only club in Kakamega, but right now we are 2 clubs in Kakamega. We were the other club now, I can say it's bigger than us, so they don't charge their fans to watch matches. So if we charge fans to watch matches, then we won't get even fans to watch our matches. So in such a situation, what's the best thing that you can do so that you get fans to pay for matches? Because I understand that money from the fans is also important in this case.
Yeah. So if your product is exactly the same as the other clubs, then there's no way that you'll ever get fans to pay or to come to your matches. So the key thing, as I said earlier, is about making your product different. Is about making your product completely different to what the other rugby club is doing. And I'm not saying you dilute what's happening on the field, but using the Savannah Bananas as an example is do some interesting stuff. You know your community. What do people engage with in your community? Try some of that stuff. Do it differently. That's the whole message. You know, the Savannah Bananas, when they started their first match, they had two people in the whole stadium at their first match. As I said, 4 years later, they've sold out a 4,000 capacity stadium for 4 consecutive years. So you need to be brave and you need to try things, and you can't offer the same product as everyone else, because as I said earlier, you're in competition. Not just with other rugby clubs, you're in competition with bars, you're in competition with casinos, you're in competition with movie houses. That's what your competition is, and you need to understand that and offer something completely different. Okay. And I'm not saying, as I said, you must dress up in yellow suits, but you know your community, you know what works in your part of Kenya. and use what you know about your community to try new things and fresh things, and critically have fun. People want to have fun. They want to have a good time. They want to go and take their families or take their friends and have a good time. And what does that good time mean? It'll mean different things to different sports and different parts of Kenya as well.
Okay, if I may, this is George from Wamba, and I mean, my view is basically sort of to agree with you in terms of, you know, having a singular approach in terms of sponsorships. And I mean, I just had a text to everyone. I said, I think the biggest challenge is when the Kenya Cup clubs want to approach a sponsor. And probably there's a particular club individually approaching the same sponsor, and the union is probably approaching the same sponsor. I mean, it doesn't really work so well for us, because all we are looking at is we start by competing against each other, as opposed to having a brand that we can all sell and, you know, have a single approach. Number one. Number two, I think it's important that we all up our game and get to a level where we are commercializing and improving the individual brands that we sell as clubs. Number one. Number two, you mentioned the atmosphere. We are competing in bars. I actually don't think we're competing with bars. I think we're trying to catch up with the bars. The bars are way ahead of us. It's
Which
much,
bars?
much
Which
easier
bars,
for...
George? Tells me, what's your favorite bars?
I don't want to mention bars because there are people here who will get angry because I won't mention theirs. But anyway, the thing is, we need to create a brand where, you know, everyone thinks about. I mean, we are so accustomed to Saturday 4 p.m. kickoff matches. I mean, 2-3 years back, we did Friday night rugby at Floodlights at Impala. And I mean, we were getting quite a lot of numbers. So, I mean, we just need to create a new perspective where rugby can be played on Friday, where rugby can be played on Sunday. And then again, yes, are our playing grounds, our pitches, our host areas safe and happy places for the family? Or are they unsafe places where, you know, there's crowd trouble and the fans are drinking and you know, people don't actually feel safe to bring their families and kids around the game? So, I mean, that would just be my comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good comment. I mean, I think one of the things that South African rugby doesn't do enough of is actually working with its clubs. So I'm not talking about the Super Rugby franchises, but I'm obviously talking about the club game below that. So they've obviously created a central competition called the Gold Cup, which the main clubs participate in. But they've never really sat around a table with the clubs and said, why don't you put all of your rights together collectively and go to market and sell them that way? Because I promise you, and I can guarantee you this, if you do it properly, a small piece of a big pie is better than no pie at all, or a big piece of a very, very small pie, if you know what I'm saying. So I think that there's definitely a model that you should really consider. And maybe some of you don't like each other and don't want to work together. That's life. But what I'm saying to you is, you're much stronger collectively. You're much stronger putting your rights together. You're much stronger putting all of your social media platforms together and going to brands like that. Because as George says, and it happens in South Africa, all of the Super Rugby teams go to all of the same sponsors and are competing for the same sponsors. So all that does is it fragments the markets, and it means the sponsors can pick and choose, and they can be in a dominant position. So what I'm saying to you is, work collectively to strengthen your position and your negotiating position with sponsors. But critically, I think the other question I'd like to throw to this group is what is unique about Kenyan rugby? What makes Kenyan rugby special that no other sport in Kenya has, or no other entertainment option has in Kenya? What is unique about the DNA of Kenyan rugby?
I was actually going to hello, my name is Teddy. I was actually going to make a comment in one of the questions. In one of the debate that we could have is, it's been a long time since I was in Kenya, but I think one of the problems that we do have or we might have is identification or the management of the USPs or the uniqueness of Kenyan rugby and the expertise to manage them when you're putting them across to the sponsors, okay? And also the balance between the value addition activities and the sport itself. And this I'm thinking about either floodlights or doing Safari Sevens, where you'd find we have proposed activities to supporters, and you'd find many people who want to come to go for their parties and not necessarily for the game itself. And my last point would be the construction of a sustainable commercial or a business model, where you find, do you go on a ticket-based kind of model, or only sponsorship as you are talking about, or starting up an academy the way Impara Saracens have to build your club. So there you go.
Okay, so those are questions. That's Teddy's post. Teddy, where are you calling from, or where are you zooming from?
From Paris.
Okay, you have a French accent. Eh?
Kenyan accent.
No, I'm joking, Teddy. Look, Teddy's posed some interesting questions, and as I say, the solutions are in this group. The solutions won't come from me. So I want to hear from other people. What do people think about what Teddy said before I give my comments? Because what works in South Africa that won't necessarily work in Kenya. What works in the UK won't necessarily work in South Africa or Kenya. And I think we need to understand that. So what do you think about what Teddy said? Any comments or questions?
When I'm talking about this, I'm thinking of my local club in Kisumu, for example, Kisumu Rugby Football Club, where we for the longest time possible, we've not even constructed a sustainable model that you can actually run with to get sponsorship, a long-term sustainable sponsorship that can help us run programs. So that comes to mind when I was asking this question.
Okay, so look, I'll come in while people are thinking. Look, as I said earlier, you're obviously struggling to get sustainable sponsorships. And as I said, the two key things about sponsorship are you're giving that sponsor access to your audiences. So what are your audiences at your rugby club? Do you have an audience? Do you even understand what your audiences are? And are you growing them in terms of audiences at the stadium, in terms of the Savannah Bananas example, but audiences on the digital platforms like the Arsenal example? Are you growing those? And are you giving access to those platforms, and are you allowing those sponsors to be able to use those platforms to engage with those audiences? And as I said, the numbers are there, gentlemen. I mean, there's 5 rugby clubs. You've got between them close to 100,000 followers on Twitter. I mean, if you combine that with the KRU, that's well over 200,000 followers, theoretically. I mean, how many rugby clubs across all of the divisions are there in Kenya, roughly?
There's approximately 50 clubs in all the divisions, Richard.
50, yeah. So obviously the clubs further down the league chain will have fewer supporters. But what I'm saying to you is, if there's 5 clubs who have close to 100,000 people following them on Twitter, imagine the combined audience across 50 clubs. I mean, that could be a really, really big number. You could be talking about 300, 400,000 people on Twitter. Now, if you package that together and go to a sponsor, I'm not sure there's another sports or another sports federation or another organization in Kenya that can rival those sort of collective numbers. Maybe soccer, but I guess soccer is also fragmented. So your numbers are there. You just need to collectively put them together and then take them to sponsors. And as I say, I know it's hard building up audiences for matches, and I know it's hard building up audiences when you don't have a lot of money, but I can't reiterate the Savannah Bananas example enough, because they started with no money and 2 spectators, and they're now attracting 4,000 people per match. And they're doing it through fun ideas, quirky stuff. They're not throwing millions and millions of shillings at the event experience and the activation experience. They're just using fun, simple ideas to create an interest in their club, and then to transfer that into people attending. And once you get people attending, then you start to unlock lots of revenue streams in terms of food and drink and ticket sales.
Richard, as you talked about the chat, if you look, I talking about the fans and fan base. There's a couple of people who posted on the side there. If you look what Joel has said about our audience, and John Ojara as well. One says we've got many fans who are not okay. We've got spectators who are not diehard fans. Okay, so they come for the experience. And mainly the hype around sevens is what brings them to rugby. So our challenge maybe is how to keep them there and how to keep them coming and make them diehard fans. What John says is the evening parties at rugby are well worth it. So people come for what is happening during the day, but they wait for the activities at night. So I don't know if that's unique to us or it's something we can build on, or I don't know what your comments are on that.
I mean, so I understand. Are you saying that the unique selling point about rugby in Kenya is the party, that it's the biggest party in Kenya? Is that what he's saying or not?
It's the most common one.
Those are not mine. I'm just picking them off the chat.
Sure.
Can I comment?
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is Joel. I'm the one who made the comment there. What we've realized is that the diehard rugby fan, most of us who played, still come and will watch and sit down for a 15th game or even a whole day of sevens. But the new rugby fan wants to come in, short attention span. Is there a village I can go have a couple of beers? Can I go and do something else like the sweet, like the Savannah Bananas? Can I go and have fun, throw some balls out there, come back? So the happenings on the pitch are not primarily why they come for rugby, but it's that question you asked. Are you replacing, they would have gone to a concert or they would have gone to church or they would have gone somewhere else, but instead they decide to come. So how do we, as Tio is saying, how do we manage to keep them for a longer period of time to come more often? Because most of them you'll find come only when we have the Safari Sevens, which is over one weekend. After that, they disappear until there's another Sevens tournament. But we have games going on every Saturday, and we don't see those same people. So you might see people 5,000 on a weekend, but the next Saturday you have 200 people. So I think it's looking at that kind of fun and what really attracts them to the place.
Correct.
And being able to.
So what is the difference in the product between the Sevens events and the Safari Sevens you talk about versus the 15s events? Because that's the issue. So you need to identify what are the differences between those two products, what attracts the crowds, and transfer some of those lessons from sevens into 15s. And I know it's hard to think about it like that because in rugby we tend to be quite traditional in our thinking. But the point I think Joel makes really well is that audiences are changing and people's tastes are changing. And if you think just a 15s 40 minutes halftime 40 minutes game is enough for people, I mean, you're kidding yourselves. You're going to be left behind. You're a bit like the if you're thinking like that, you're a bit like the meter taxi drivers with Uber coming. You have to think about your business model and changing it. You have to think about the Uber economy, as it were, and what people want. And you can still have the core of what's important to your sport in terms of what happens on the field. But as I say, the event experience is so important. So as I say, women's sport is becoming more and more important, and attracting female audiences becoming more important. I mean, to my earlier point about the toilets like for men and women at your facilities. Fantastic. No issues.
I absolutely not. So I think most of the Kenyan stadiums have no support of such kind of facilities. So I think what I have witnessed in most rugby events will be the mobile toilets that will be installed for that purpose. Because you remember, and maybe just for the information of the audience, we used to work with Richard up to until 2016.
It was about
was it 20?
that, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I joined Tennis South Africa at the beginning of 2017. Yeah.
So when we conducted a survey here locally as well, we found that most women have the same sentiment about Kenyan stadiums, not just rugby, but even across football. And one of the reasons why they don't want to come to the stadium is because they have no decent and clean toilets to go to as and when they need, and that was one of the biggest issues. And obviously, one of the other issues is whether the kids have the opportunity to interact and to play in a safe area where I, as a parent, want to enjoy the game, but I have no one to take care of my kid when I want to do that. So I think that delicate balance is also a challenge locally. Yeah.
I've just seen another question. It was related to a checklist. Could you give us a very brief checklist that would help us during negotiations to optimize our value propositions? So I think the thing to say, my personal view, and this is quite a strong view, so I apologize, but if you're negotiating according to a checklist, you don't have a chance. So what I mean by that is, what tends to happen with a lot of people who approach brands for sponsorship is they'll put together like a presentation or a document, and they'll send that presentation to a beer company. They'll send the identical presentation to an airline. They'll send the identical presentation to a cellular company. They'll send the identical presentation to a motor vehicle manufacturer. Now, the flaw in that approach is every one of those brands is different. Every one of those brands operates in a different industry. Every one of those brands has different needs and objectives. And so that sort of scattergun approach, for me, you're going to be very, very lucky to get any sponsors if you go down that route. For me, the most effective way of finding a sponsor is, as I said, is to understand what is unique about your club or what is unique about Kenyan rugby. And I think there's some good ideas coming through. And then saying, okay, so this is what my unique selling points are. Doing your research about the brands and sponsors, because as I say, what works for a beer company won't work for a cellular company, won't necessarily work for an airline. Doing your research on the brands and actually saying, okay, these are my unique selling points, and this is a brand who will interface or integrate or will be able to use my unique selling points. And I'll go back to my tennis example with Tennis South Africa. As I said, unique selling points of tennis are wealthy people, business decision makers. So we went to a property company who needs business decision makers to make decisions about putting their companies into the buildings that the property company owns, into the retail chains that the property company owns. That's the point I'm trying to make. So a sport like tennis wouldn't work for a beer brand, because a beer brand is about mass consumption. It's about big groups of numbers. Sports like football, rugby work for beer brands. But that's my point I'm trying to make is, you need to do your research. You need to speak to people. And for me, the way I do sponsorship is I have a conversation with someone first and ask lots of questions and really understand what the brand is about and what they're trying to achieve. And then we go away and we put together a proposition based on the brand needs. And as I said, what tends to is we fire off a presentation and with a standard package of rights. And that's, for me, if you have 1% success from that approach, you're doing very well.
Okay. I think there's another question from Maurice Masiga, and he's asking about the relationship between the university teams and the club teams in South Africa, and what is the collaboration like, especially he expands and says, do university teams benefit from that relationship in terms of sponsorship?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in South Africa, I think like Kenya, all of the universities play in club leagues. But what the universities have done very successfully is they've created their own competition called the Varsity Cup. And what they did about 10 or so years ago is they entered into a commercial deal with Francois Pienaar. Do you remember Francois Pienaar, the Springbok captain when South Africa won the 1995 World Cup? He was played by Matt Damon in that Hollywood movie, if you remember, Invictus. So Francois Pienaar set up a sports marketing company, and he engaged with all of the big universities in South Africa. And he said, okay, listen, universities, I'm going to buy all of your commercial rights for this competition. So all of your sponsorship rights, all of your ticketing rights, all of your merchandising rights. And I'm going to pay you a certain amount per year. Now I'm going to go away and find sponsors. And it's so in a way, what they've done is as per what I've suggested to you, is they're operating on a collective basis. So they've put all of their rights as universities together, created this club competition, and Francois Pinault's gone out and sold the sponsorship rights to the Varsity Cup to 3 or 4 sponsors. So 3 or 4 universities have one sponsor, 3 or 4 universities have another sponsor, but it's all done on a collective basis, which is, I guess, is exactly what I'm saying to you. Is they've come together, they've put all their rights together, they're working with a professional sports marketing agency, and they've brought in a number of big sponsors, and their matches are televised on TV. I mean, some of the big university matches in South Africa now, Stellenbosch University versus Cape Town University, which is a local derby match down on the coast, they get 20, 30,000 people for those matches. And all of those matches are broadcast live on TV. So there's definitely, so that's what the universities have done successfully. And that's a really good lesson, I think, again, for Kenyan rugby. But can you all work together? That's the question. Because it's easy to say, come together, put all your rights in, but can you all work together? Because obviously there's bigger clubs, there's smaller clubs. I mean, that's something, if you were to progress that, you'd need to work out how the revenue would be allocated. But you're definitely stronger together than apart. Definitely.
There's a question from Vice Chairman Thomas Opio. He says, hi, Richard, one of the challenges we face is placing a value on our various products as a sport. Could you give us a brief checklist that would help us during negotiations to optimize our value propositions in order not to fall outside the bargaining window? I think he's saying we've got 10 products. What do we do with them?
Well, are there 10 products? Is that what you're saying? Are there 10 products?
He's a vice chairman of the union, so he'd be talking about his national teams, his leagues, his test matches, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think, look, trying to sell 10 products that's tough. I think that's a very tough ask, trying to sell 10 products. You need to think creatively and say, actually, can we combine some of those products? And I'm not saying combine them in terms of collapsing leagues or competitions together. What I'm saying is creating a value proposition where there's 2 or 3 products in one package, as it were, and going to market like that. I mean, I think that's the best suggestion I've got. You've got more chance of selling 4 products than you are of selling 10 products. So look, I'm not up to speed with what those products are, but I'm sure there's ways of combining the products and taking them to sponsors. And from a valuation perspective, I know clubs are often reluctant to spend money on marketing and research, but without spending a bit of money on marketing and research and being able to quantify your audience, I mean, it's a very, very difficult negotiation because the brand will always have the advantage over you. But if you can go to a brand and say, I've got X 100,000 social media followers, this is what we know about them. We've got X 100,000 rugby players in our club or in our competition or across the country. This is what we know about them. We've got X 100,000 supporters across the country. This is what we know about them. That allows you to arrive at a value, or at least allows you to enter into a negotiation on a business basis as opposed to a donation basis. Because I think the biggest frustration that brands have is when people come to ask for sponsorship is that the people can't tell them how big their audience is. So they say, okay, I want, I don't know, 1 million shillings to sponsor this. But how many people will my brand touch? How many people will my brand be exposed to? I don't know. So if you can't answer those questions, I mean, you can't have a negotiation, and then all you're doing is you're operating on a donation basis or a chairman's folly basis. And chairman's folly, I'm sure some of you have heard that, but if a chairman of a company likes something, then you can maybe convince him to sponsor it for a year or 2, but that's no sustainable basis on which to operate. It's all about audiences, ladies and gentlemen. You need to understand your audience and be able to quantify your audience. I mean, if you can't do that, you're on the back foot from a sponsorship perspective. But the great thing is with these social media platforms, as I say, Impala Saracens, 35,000 people follow them on Twitter. I mean, there's a lot of information that you can dig into and unpack about who those people are and what they do from a negotiation perspective.
Okay. So maybe before we go to this Paris who wants to speak, maybe before we go to that, I just wanted to share a quick experience that I have seen in my experience of marketing sports in Kenya. And of course, rugby is unique because I think when we started off, the fan base was 2% or thereabout. It grew to 4%, and I think now it's sitting on around 9% of the entire sporting fan base in Kenya, which is quite a growth if you look at it from the comparison of other sports in the country. But what we also notice that rugby in Kenya shares the similar attributes with Kenya Golf Union. If I was to put like for like in terms of how the leadership or how the culture of sourcing sponsorship is concerned. This is what I mean. When, for example, you look at how the Kenya Amateur Golf Union operate and how they market, you'll find that individual member clubs will go out and look for a sponsor, and therefore they will get as low sponsorship as 50,000, 100,000 Kenya shillings. At the very best, probably 500,000 Kenya shillings. And this has greatly hampered the growth of golf in Kenya. This is the same blueprint that probably is happening in the rugby scene. And you, for example, if I would use a national 7 circuit, you'll find that the host clubs, maybe 6 or so of them, everyone has gone in their little way to a friend, Richard Sportkov, a chairman or an MD who likes you and have given you 500,000 or 100,000 or 1 million. And then with that in mind, it means that this brand sees you as the direct access to the series, and therefore in totality that brand can spend probably 500,000 across 6 host clubs, and that means they have spent only 3 million shillings across the season to get access to all your premium assets. You can see that all the teams, the top teams in the country are there for a weekend. And therefore, for them, of course, they are laughing all the way to the bank. If it's a beer company, the sales are tremendous because research has shown that a typical rugby fan has an ability on a daily or on a match day to spend in excess of 2,500 or thereabout shillings outside of the ticket. So this, in a sense, the brands in Kenya have understood that they employed divide and rule strategy to rugby, and obviously give them lower value. Probably the secretariat of that particular team, or now the Kenya Rugby Union, because they always have to chip in because of the budget shortfalls. Because of the fragmentation of the rights. So probably my advice or my appeal would be to look for a way to collectively sell these rights instead of fragmenting them. And I think if you look at and of course now it has deteriorated, how the Premier League used to sell their rights 5 years ago, 10 to 5 years ago, it was more of a joint strategy, and every time a brand tried to approach a singular team, they were unable to penetrate because everyone had to have a visibility of what sponsorships are coming in, and that's why brands like SuperSport used to give Premier League $2.4 million every year as sponsorships. with brands like SportPesa giving them like $1 million or thereabout every year. So if we could find a formula of working together, and this is the, I don't know, Richard, in South Africa, how funds and officials of upper tier or more niche sports like rugby and now tennis operate, because I think the more sophisticated the officials are, the more difficult it is for them to work together. I don't know whether it is the same in South Africa as here.
There's always politics in all sport. There's always politics. I think the point is that you should be united by commercial interests in that. I think if you establish the rules very clearly up front, and you establish particularly the allocation of monies and a methodology for allocating any commercial revenue that's earned collectively, I think that's really important. So it has to be in writing, it has to be hammered out around a table. It can't be on a handshake, because that's where problems happen.
Okay. So I think, Richard, there's a lady called Paris that wanted to ask a question.
Sure.
Paris, if you can hear us. I think she's disappeared.
Is she not with Teddy in Paris?
No. I wanted to ask, if you fragment some of the products, won't that make them lose value?
I wasn't necessarily saying fragment the products. I was saying, rather than trying to sell 10 products, I was saying try to find a way to take 2 products together and try and sell them together, rather than try and sell 10 individual products. So look, it's hard for me to comment, because I don't know what the 10 products are. But from a sponsorship perspective, a struggle to sell 10 things. But if you can package 2 together, and there might be 2 different events, that's not the point. But if you can package them together and take them to a sponsor under one theme, and find one sponsor to sponsor both, it's a lot easier than trying to sell 10 individual things. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
There's a question here on Jeff. Jeff's asking the question on governance. Comes up in both club and national team. So, I mean, is that a big concern for brands and sponsors in Kenya? Do they ask you a lot about governance? Is that fair to say?
In my experience, it's probably the first question.
Sorry, my kids are just shouting outside. They're obviously wanting me to get off the call.
No.
So I'll have it could be a few more minutes. Look, I think from a governance perspective, I think what you need to be able to demonstrate, and it's something that I think Tennis South Africa has been able to demonstrate, is that one is we have good governance structures in terms of good oversight from the board. We have good subcommittees, and we have key subcommittees from a governance perspective. So we have an audit committee, we have a risk and ethics committee. We have lots of committees that oversee key aspects of tennis, and I think that's really important. But critically, we're also very, very transparent in terms of how we spend sponsorship money. So BNP Paribas is an example. I mean, they spend a lot of money on tennis. You'd be surprised how much money they spend. But in terms of how we report to them, we account for every single, in currency, which is the rand, in every rand and cent that is spent. And that's, they obviously started on a small basis with Tennis South Africa about 2 years ago, and have now invested a huge amount of money, because they recognize the fact that they know they can see transparently, and from a transparency perspective, that the money that they're putting into tennis is being spent in the right areas. And so that transparency is really, really important. And I think people often say, oh, well, you know, the sponsor's paying, I don't know, 1 million shillings, but some of that money we're using to spend on admin fees, and it's not technically on that sponsorship. But the point to make is you should be negotiating that upfront with a sponsor. Because we're very clear with BNP Paribas that this percentage of money goes towards their sponsorship, and that percentage of money goes towards admin. So it goes towards paying my salary, it goes towards running the office, it goes towards paying costs of the organization. And I think if you explain that to them, they understand that, because it's all very, if there's no one there to deliver the sponsorship, they're not going to get their value. So I think a lot of sponsors will understand that some of that sponsorship money has to go to running costs if you're very upfront and clear with them and transparent about it. And the other thing I just wanted to add about sponsorship, just because our time is running out, is that I think a lot of people think once that sponsorship contract is signed, then all the hard work is over. You can sit back, you can collect the cash, you can spend the cash, and then speak to them again in 2 years or a year or 3 years when the sponsorship agreement is over. But in reality, signing the sponsor is the easiest bit. Delivering on that sponsorship, working with that sponsor, collaborating with that sponsor, communicating with that sponsor almost on a weekly basis is even more important, because the easiest sponsorship deal to do is to renew a sponsorship. The hardest sponsorship to do is to sign a new sponsor. And if you can go on a journey with a sponsor and be transparent and communicate with them on a regular basis, and there will be ups and downs, of course, but if you can go through those, it's absolutely critical that once the contract is signed, that's when the hard work begins, and that's when you should be spending much more quality time and showing the sponsor more love. And that's the only way you can keep sponsors. As I say, retaining a sponsorship is the easiest sponsorship deal to sign. Finding the new ones, that's the difficult thing.
Hi, Richard. This is Paris.
Hello, Paris.
Not the state in France.
It's lovely to hear a female voice, Paris, in rugby. That's wonderful.
Oh, thank you very much. These are actually my thoughts on a way in which maybe we can strengthen and solidify the widespread support for the game, especially in the Kenyan environment that we're in. Bearing in mind that it's a bit looking at how before, when I was actually growing up in the sport, and to at least how different sectors of the game used to come together. That was from schools, championship clubs, even the Kenya Cup Cups, that would actually happen more. Like you'd find the Prescott Cup final being played as a curtain raiser for one of the matches, and you'd find the sponsor back then in 2004 would be Coca-Cola, and then you'd find Bamburi Super Series also is actually there as a sponsor for one of the Super League games, and then you'd also find the club finals as well being played. So I think it's more of a collective approach that you had stated earlier, of building a product that will endear sponsors across all sectors of the game.
Yeah, that's an excellent comment. Yeah, thank you. I think I just wanted to build on two thoughts that I've got on the back of your contribution. I think what we see in South Africa is huge growth in interest in sponsoring women's, and I'm assuming it's probably the same in Kenya, that there's growing interest in sponsoring women's rugby and women's sports, and I think that's a huge opportunity for your clubs to consider, because I think that's a huge growth area, and you'll be ahead of the curve if you can offer those sorts of properties to sponsors, definitely. So I think that's a really important point, and I think I've actually forgotten what the other point is, so it can't be that important. But I think women's rugby and women's sports is such a huge growth area. I mean, we're seeing more interest in South Africa from a tennis perspective in women's tennis at the moment than men's tennis, and I think that's just a recognition from sponsors that the female audience is hugely powerful and is growing in importance. And I think that's a real opportunity for rugby to get ahead of the game in terms of other sports in Kenya and really try and dominate and own that market from a female sport perspective.
Okay, if there's anyone with anything really burning to ask Richard, we'll take that question now, but I'd like to release him. He's been with us for a good 2 hours, and we're very grateful for that. So if there's anyone with any question that's burning, just unmute yourself and ask it quickly. Thanks.
Richard. Thank you for your time. What's the best thing we can go back and tell our clubs to convince them that they need to invest money in marketing and sponsorship when they're busy trying to get money to pay for salaries for players, to pay for those toilets you mentioned about? When we go back to our clubs and tell them, hey, we just listened to Richard, and he says we need to invest in marketing and sponsorship if we want to take this to the next level. What do they hear? What's the top thing that catches their attention?
Well, it's having to spend money. I guess that's the concern. I guess it becomes a chicken and egg situation. You have to invest to grow, but if you can't invest, then you can't grow. Look, I specifically wanted to use. I know I've hammered home this one, but the Savannah Bananas is a very good example, and I'd really encourage people to just do some research on them, and visit on YouTube or visit on a website. I saw someone had provided the link to their websites and stuff, and the reason I wanted to use that example is that's an example of an organization that's got very little money to spend, or traditionally has had no money to spend on marketing. And so how they've marketed themselves is they've done crazy stuff. You know, as I said, in one match, their team played in kilts. They've done all sorts of stuff which doesn't actually cost money, which raises awareness. And as I said, I'm not saying to you, go back to your clubs and say, Richard says you must all play in kilts. But what I'm saying to you is there's low cost or no cost ideas, and they are a bit out the box and they're a bit different, but those are the sorts of things you should be thinking about. And I think you should really be also, you've got social media, and a lot of you seem to have very active social media accounts and good social media audiences. Those are such powerful platforms in terms of marketing your clubs and providing a window into what your club is doing. So the point I'm trying to make in a very long-winded way is the marketing ideas don't have to cost money. I mean, an idea can be free, and sometimes the best ideas are the free ones. Try things, be brave, do different things. Just really look at what the Savannah Bananas have done and try and be different and try and do things completely differently to what any other sport in Kenya is doing. And that doesn't cost millions of shillings to do. The only cost is your time and your brain power in terms of coming up with good ideas. And as I say, I know America's a different place, but they started with two fans in the stadium. They, as I said, they now sell out every game, 4,000 people. And you saw from that video, they're not spending big money on marketing or anything like that. It's the power of creative ideas and wacky ideas and out the box thinking and ideas.
Okay. I think there's a final question here from Alex asking how you would describe the culture of rugby in South Africa as opposed to the rest of the continent.
Look, I think rugby in South Africa is complex because South Africa as a country, because of our history, is complex. I mean, we obviously live in a very unequal country, and we've got a history of obviously inequality and fragmentation in terms of different communities. And I think that is still reflected in our rugby. I think there is still a lot of fragmentation. I do think the culture in rugby is changing, and it's changing for the better. And I think if you look at the picture behind me, if you look at the different cultures that are represented there, it gives you some hope for the future of rugby. I think if you think about the 2007 World Cup, if you think about the trophy picture there, it would have been very much a white Afrikaans group of men holding up the Rugby World Cup. And I think for the first time, rugby's really taken a step forward as an inclusive sport because of what's happened on the back of the 2019 Rugby World Cup win, and the fact that it was such a cohesive unit of men from so many different backgrounds and such diverse background. So I think, look, I'm not here to preach to you about how wonderful South African sports is and South African rugby is and South African tennis is, because it's not. We've got our challenges like anyone else. So look, it's still fragmented, but it is getting better. But we've still got a long way to go, both in all of our sports, but as a country as well, to be really an inclusive and cohesive and collective country. I don't know, what is your perception of the culture of rugby in South Africa? Because it's always interesting to hear others' views on that. I mean, how do you perceive rugby in South Africa? I mean, can I ask a question? Do you more identify at the moment with the Springbok rugby team or the All Blacks or Australian rugby team or the English rugby team? I mean, in Kenyan rugby, which is the other nation that most Kenyan rugby fans would most identify with?
Maybe we need to throw the chairman under the bus to answer on behalf of members who don't want to say.
Well, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just
other than South Africa and New Zealand, we have quite a group of fans who follow the Aussies. The Aussies have quite a big following, I think, from the days of Michael Liner and Campisi. And then also the English have a growing band of local fans as well. French, maybe not as big, but I think between those four, those are the most supported international teams. The guys who follow Sevens keenly also we have a very soft spot for Fiji. I'm yet to meet any Kenyan who doesn't just admire how the Fijians play. So Fiji is quite a popular name here as well.
Look, yeah, I mean, I think South African rugby has a big challenge at the moment on its hands, and it's because we lose all of our best players now. They go and play in France or in Japan or in the UK. And I think that's a big issue for particularly our Super Rugby teams and particularly the sort of the commercial propositions for our Super Rugby teams, because so many of our best players now play overseas. And I think that what that means is that the business models around our Super Rugby teams are under real threat, because they play in big stadiums, which have huge running costs. For most Super Rugby games, there's maybe 20,000 people there. So in a 50 or 60,000 capacity stadium, that's a big issue. So I think that there's big question marks about the sustainability of the current business model, particularly in terms of Super Rugby. And I think increasingly South African rugby is looking north. And I think increasingly you'll see South African rugby gravitate away from the south and towards the north. And that makes sense from a time zone perspective. I mean, it makes sense for a lot of reasons. So I think increasingly you'll definitely see that. There'll definitely be a breakaway between SA Rugby and the other Sanzar nations for those reasons. All right.
Thomas and Chairman Jeff, I don't know whether there's any other observation before we...
There's just one last question from Edwin Kagota down in Mombasa. And the question to Richard is, how does one level the playground? Because the gap between the big clubs and small clubs is very huge. Any insights you can give to this? And the typical experience of a club, what you'd call a small club, is you basically find it has one guy who runs everything. Plus he funds the club and he spends his Thursday and Friday trying to raise money to ensure that the club is able to honor its fixtures. So some of these things that we talk about, it's good to say we'll build a digital strategy, but it's a one-man army for all intents and purposes.
What is Edwin's club in Mombasa?
Shepherds.
It's from Shepherds.
Okay, so Shepherds is Shepherds a small club in comparison to some of the other clubs?
I didn't say it.
Look, I think the reality in life and the reality in sports is that there's always going to be big dogs and there's going to be smaller dogs. I think the smaller dogs, if they try and copy the big dogs, well, they're never going to compete because the big dogs will always be ahead of them. And so the smaller dogs or the smaller clubs need to think differently, and they need to think out the box, and they need to do things much more creatively. And in terms of a one-man army and a one-man band, I guess that's the challenge in a lot of clubs across a lot of sports, is that you get these linchpins of a club that keep these clubs alive. But I guess the question is what can you do to widen your team or widen your group of volunteers to help you? Why are you the only person who's carrying the club on your shoulders? Because that's just not, unfortunately, is not sustainable. So are there other people, and can you get younger people involved to help you? Because I always think that the right balance is age gives you wisdom and experience, or it should do anyway. It should give you wisdom and experience, and youth gives you energy and fresh ideas and fresh thinking. And for me, the best teams that I've seen have teams that are combining both. Is the old, experienced, wise heads and the young, fresh young lions who've obviously got the legs to do all the hard work. So I think what I'm basically saying is if you're a small club, you can't copy how a big club operates. You've got to try and do it completely differently, and you've got to disrupt things, and try and be completely different to what a big club is. And that's a very general, high level answer, but that's really the only point, because a small club in Mombasa versus a small club somewhere else in the country, that might mean different things. But the point is, you can't copy a big club, or you need to find a rich Russian or Chinese owner who can come in, like the football clubs in the UK do, so he can come in and spend billions and billions of shillings.
Okay, I think we're right at the tail end of this, and mine really, on behalf of the Kenya Rugby fraternity, is to say a big thank you to you, Richard, for having spent your evening with us, for sharing your thoughts with us. We have certainly learned a lot, and this has been quite eye-opening. Some of the challenges we know about, maybe we've just never spelled out what we see, but I'm sure for all the different teams represented here, and I can confirm there's quite a spread of club officials from various clubs right across the country. So we've all gained from your insight, and I would hope that maybe in another 3 months or so, we could reach out to you again and say, hey, we did this 3 months ago. Any changes, any lessons? I'm hoping by then we'll be in a full post-COVID situation, and people will be taking to heart the things that we've learned. And I think for us as a board, we really want to equip all the clubs with the tools that they need so that they can really build successful enterprises. And if club rugby is strong and well-funded, then the national team will be the biggest beneficiary. You cannot succeed at the top if your base is weak. And this is one of the deliberate actions that we're taking to help build capacity. So I'm most grateful to you. And again, certainly at the right time, we'll also invite you to come to Nairobi. Look for one of the times we have a good game here, a good international match in the new year. You can also come and before that, again, meet the people face to face. So to me, you're going to be our consultant whom we don't pay anything because we can't afford you.
No, well, I'm not here for the money. So thank you. I'd obviously love to come and watch an Impala Saracens game, as you said, as the best club in Kenya.
But I didn't say that, but
no, I'm just teasing. He didn't say that.
Yeah, you are still my constituent.
Yeah. Look. I think one of the things I'd like to say is that I think it's always daunting in these situations. Is you don't know where to start, and because you don't know where to start, it's just easier not to do anything, and you just continue to do the things you've always done. And I'm just wondering, just thinking out loud, if there's an opportunity for us to work together. I'm not saying on a paid basis, I'm not expecting any money, but to put together like a basic toolkit, like a marketing toolkit for clubs that says, these are the sort of the basic things that you need to do from a marketing perspective. These are the basic things you need to do in the commercial space. I mean, that's something that we're doing for our tennis clubs in South Africa, because there's a number of clubs that are struggling, and giving them just a basic toolkit in terms of showing them where to start and how to start. And I mean, that's something I'd be happy to engage with the KRU on a pro bono basis. So I'm very happy to get involved and assist in that basis, because Kenyan rugby is a very, very special part of the rugby brotherhood and sisterhood across the world. But I think Kenyan rugby is very, very unique, and I'd love to see Kenyan rugby grow and thrive, not just in sevens but in 15s as well.
Thank you, Richard. Your kind offer is accepted immediately, and obviously work closely with you and try and agree as well, so that and that sort of toolkit is what we need. And we more to the clubs, we want to do this not just for marketing, but even for other aspects of administration in the club, because we realize that there's a lot of training for coaches and training for referees and citing officers, but very little for club administrators. Yet they carry probably the biggest burden in terms of ensuring these clubs work. So whatever we can do to equip them with the tools will be most welcome. So,
the only payment I will demand, Mr. Chairman, is an ice cold Tusker. All right, an ice cold Tusker when I can get up to Nairobi again. That's one beer. That's all I ask for in payment.
You'll be pleased to know Tusker is still our sponsor, so we'll deliver as many as we want.
A lifetime supply, a lifetime supply. But listen, also I must say that you must, everyone on this call must think about speaking to Agri and using Agri, because I've obviously had the privilege and pleasure of working in the UK, working in South Africa, working in many countries. And I can honestly say Agri is one of the smartest and most talented young men I've ever worked with. So he's a huge asset to Kenya and Kenyan sports, and you should really try and tap into his strategic thinking, because he is as good as I've worked with. He really is that good. And Agri, I hope my check's in the mail for that promotion. All right.
Thank you.
But all jokes aside, he's a very, very talented human being, and he's a very smart thinker from a sports marketing perspective. And as I say, the solutions to Kenyan challenges will be within Kenya. They won't be from South Africans sitting thousands of kilometers away. Kenyan rugby and Kenyan people will find their solutions.
And I'll just mention, Richard, we have been working with Agri since his days at Frontiers, and now that he's in his... And yes, he needs to deliver another big sponsor to KRU. He was instrumental in bringing us Sport Pesa. And yeah, but we're working on things together, and also he's graciously agreed to assist some of the clubs. I think there's one club in the lower leagues who have been talking to some sponsors, and I'd really love to go with them to the meetings, but at times I can't go with them to all the meetings. So Agri is here, he's a professional, he's a better negotiator than myself, and he'll be able to point them in the right direction. So yeah, by all means, let's work with Agri. And also, we are really trying to see if we can bundle some of the products, especially the leagues, together, and market it as a league. Look at how the league takes off in a way that makes the product different. So we have a live experiment like right now. So I won't talk more. Maybe hopefully post-COVID we'll be able to close and come back, and at the next webinar we can use that as a case study of some of the lessons that we've learned.
Yeah, so that's great. And I think this has been a really interesting engagement. As I said, that my office stands to assist on a pro bono basis. I see this has been recorded, so I can't backtrack now and try and ask for money. Okay, but I'm happy to assist where I can. All right.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you all. Thank you for your contributions, and thank you for some excellent points and questions. I mean, Agri has all of my contact details, so if you have any specific questions, I see there's one about COVID-19 in terms of how Tier 10 of South Africa has been dealing with COVID-19. I'm actually part of a group of sports leaders in South Africa who've been working with our government to try and navigate our way through this COVID-19 crisis in the context of return to training and return to play, both for contact and non-contact sports. So I've got a lot of information in terms of what we've been doing there, which I'm also very happy to share if anyone's interested. So, all right.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
I think for us, there are a couple of board members on the call, and I think we'll stay behind for a few minutes. Maybe certain people want to ask us one or two questions, more housekeeping in the place, so we'll be here to take those questions, but happy to release yourself and Agri as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having us, and have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Lovely to speak to you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.